everyone, and welcome back. I am so excited for today's deep dive
Me too.
because we're tackling a book that has sparked so much debate and discussion.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. Now, before we jump in, I want to be clear.
Okay.
This isn't just a history lesson, okay? We're not just going to summarize the book.
Right.
We're going to explore how this idea of civilizations as these, major cultural forces, how they actually shape global politics today, how they rise and fall.
It's a big one.
It's a huge topic, and maybe even get a glimpse of what the future holds.
I love it.
So buckle up, because we're going to be tackling some seriously big questions.
Oh, yeah, hit me.
Like, did you know there are countries out there that are literally torn between civilizations?
Torn countries.
Yeah. Or that the West's dominance that we kind of take for granted
Right.
might not last forever.
That's a good one.
Yeah, so to help us unpack all of this, we have our expert on all things civilizations.
Well, I don't know about all things.
Well, you know a lot more than I do, so let's dive in, I guess you could say.
Okay, well, let's do it.
So Huntington's book, it really shook things up when it came out.
It did. It really kind of changed the whole conversation about global politics.
Yeah, because his main argument, if I'm getting this right,
Go for it.
is that we've moved beyond, that old Cold War rivalry.
Yeah.
The superpowers facing off.
The U.S. versus the Soviet Union.
Right, exactly. And instead, he's saying that the real action is
Yeah.
happening between these, huge cultural groups, these civilizations.
It's like the Battle of the Titans, but instead of gods, it's these ancient cultural groups.
Exactly. And they're the ones driving global politics now.
He's basically saying that culture trumps ideology in the post-Cold War world.
Okay, so scratch the red versus blue map from the Cold War.
Yep, that's gone.
What does Huntington's world map look like then?
It's a much more colorful map.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that. He paints a picture of a world that's multipolar,
Yeah.
with many different power centers. And it's all about civilizations.
Yeah.
He even includes these really interesting maps in the book.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like snapshots of the world in different eras. So in the 1960s, it was all about the U.S. and the Soviet Union,
That Cold War face-off.
Yeah, exactly.
Huh.
But then you jump to the 1990s and beyond, and things get much more complex.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
You've got the West, of course, but also the Cynic civilization, which is basically Chinese,
Okay.
the Islamic world, Hindu civilization, Japanese Orthodox, Latin American.
Yeah.
And he even suggests that maybe there's an African civilization emerging.
Wow, so many players.
And each one with its own values,
Yeah.
history, way of seeing the world.
So not just countries jostling for power anymore, but these entire civilizations,
Yeah.
each with its own, unique cultural DNA.
Yeah, it's like international relations meets cultural anthropology.
Okay, but help me out here. What exactly makes a civilization, in Huntington's view?
Good question.
Is it just about geography, like where you're born?
He goes much deeper than that. He says a civilization is the broadest level of a person's cultural identity.
Okay, broader than nationality.
It goes broader, yeah. Think of it as the cultural group you feel the strongest connection to.
Okay, I can see how that gets a little fuzzy.
It definitely can. Because for Huntington, a civilization includes everything.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Language, history, religion, customs, institutions, even how you see yourself in relation to the world.
So it's not just about being born in a certain place.
No, it's more about the values and traditions you identify with, the stories you tell yourself about who you are and where you belong.
I can see how that can get kind of messy.
Oh, it definitely can.
Yeah.
Imagine living in, say, ancient Rome.
Okay, good example.
Are you Roman first?
Hmm.
Italian? A citizen of the empire?
How do people choose which identity matters most in a given situation?
That's the really interesting part. These identities can overlap and shift depending on what's going on around you.
So it's fluid. It's not fixed.
Exactly. And those choices about which part of your identity to prioritize, that's what can fuel a lot of the conflict and the alliance building that we see in the world.
So even within a civilization, there can be these different layers.
Absolutely. It's not this monolithic thing. It's dynamic. It's constantly evolving.
This is where it gets fascinating to me. Because if civilizations are these powerful forces,
Okay.
how do they change over time? I mean, they rise and fall, right?
Exactly. They go through stages almost like a life cycle.
Like a person.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And yes, decline is definitely part of that.
So it's not just about being conquered or defeated militarily.
No, it's much more complex than that. Huntington argues that civilizations can experience periods of serious decay.
Okay, and what are some of the symptoms of that decay?
Well, he talks about things like a stagnant economy, political chaos, and people losing faith in their leaders and institutions. It's almost like a loss of vitality, a loss of the will to keep going.
So it's almost like a civilization can get sick from the inside.
That's a really good way to put it. And if they don't adapt and reform themselves, they can eventually collapse.
Do you have a historical example of how this played out? Like a civilization that went through this process of decline?
Well, the decline of the Ottoman Empire is a classic example.
No.
They weren't simply defeated militarily. They also suffered from internal problems.
Like what?
Well, they had a loss of confidence in their leadership. They struggled to keep up with the times, and they faced growing pressure from rival civilizations. All of these factors contributed to their eventual downfall.
So it was kind of a death by a thousand cuts.
Yeah, you could say that. It's rarely one single thing that brings down a civilization. It's usually a combination of internal and external factors.
This might be a naive question, but with all the globalization and technology spreading everywhere, isn't everyone becoming more westernized anyway?
It's a common question.
Doesn't that kind of make this whole civilizations clash thing a little less relevant?
That's a really common assumption. But one of Huntington's most important points is that modernization isn't the same as westernization.
Okay, so you're saying that just because a country adopts things like modern technology or economic ideas doesn't mean they're abandoning their own culture and becoming Western.
Exactly. They can modernize without losing their own unique identity.
So you're saying there are different ways to respond to the West's influence?
Absolutely. He outlines three main paths that non-Western societies can take.
It's okay, lay it on me.
First, they can completely reject the West and everything it stands for.
Like a total rejection.
Yep. Turn their backs on Western values and try to create their own separate path.
Okay, that's one option. What's the second?
They can go all in on Westernization, which he calls Kemalism.
Kemalism.
It's named after Turkey's leader, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who tried to rapidly modernize and westernize Turkish society in the early 20th century.
Oh, wow. So like a total transformation.
Yeah, a pretty radical approach.
And what's the third path?
The third path is what he calls reformism, which is basically finding a middle ground.
Okay.
Blending modernization with their own existing traditions.
So like picking and choosing what works for them.
Exactly. Taking the best of both worlds and creating a hybrid system.
So Turkey under Ataturk, that seems like a pretty dramatic example of this whole Kemalism thing. Trying to completely change a society's culture like that.
It was a huge undertaking.
How successful was that?
Well, it's a mixed bag. They made some progress in terms of modernization, but it also caused a lot of social and political upheaval.
So it's not as easy as just flipping a switch and saying, okay, we're Western now.
Definitely not.
Well,
Culture is a complex thing. It's deeply rooted. You can't just erase it overnight.
So this idea of a single universal civilization that everyone should adopt, that's probably not very realistic.
Huntington would say it's highly unlikely. Different societies have different needs, different values, different histories. They're going to find their own paths to modernization and development.
There's another part of the book that really jumped out at me. Huntington talks about this resurgence of religion in a world that's supposedly becoming more secular. Why is that happening? Isn't that the opposite of what you'd expect with globalization and all?
It is a bit counterintuitive, but it's a real phenomenon. It's not just about fundamentalism or extremism. There's a broader return to religious values across many different societies.
How interesting. So where are we seeing this?
Well, we see it in South Korea with the growth of Christianity, in Latin America with the rise of evangelicalism, and of course with the rise of political Islam in various parts of the world.
So it's not just one religion or one region?
Nope. It's a global trend. It seems like people are searching for something more than what modern life offers. Something to ground them, to give them a sense of meaning and purpose.
You mean like a sense of belonging? A community?
Exactly. Religion can provide a sense of identity, a moral framework, a way to make sense of the world, especially in a world that's changing so rapidly. It can offer a source of stability and certainty.
So in a way, it's a reaction to all the uncertainty and rapid change that comes with globalization.
You could say that. It's like people are looking for an anchor in a storm.
That makes sense. It's like when things feel chaotic and out of control, people turn to things that feel familiar and comforting.
Exactly. And religion can provide that comfort, that sense of belonging, that connection to something larger than themselves.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting for me. Huntington talks about this unexpected alliance.
Okay, which one?
The one forming between two civilizations that seem totally different. The Confucian and the Islamic.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating one.
Then help me understand this one. How does that even work? They seem like they have nothing in common.
On the surface, yeah, it seems strange. But if you look closer, You see that both of these civilizations have some major grievances with the West.
Okay, like what?
Well, they feel like the West has dominated them economically and militarily for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
They resent Western cultural influence, and they want to create a new world order where they have more power and autonomy.
So basically, they're teaming up to push back against Western power?
That's a big part of it. They see strength in numbers, and they believe that by working together, they can challenge the West's dominance.
But their cultures are so different.
They are. But that shared resentment of the West, that desire for a more multipolar world, it's enough to create a common ground.
So what kind of impact could this alliance have?
It's hard to say for sure,
Mm.
but it's definitely a potential game changer.
Okay, in what way?
Think about it. China is already selling arms to Muslim-majority countries.
Really?
Yep. And we've seen leaders like Mahathir of Malaysia and Gaddafi of Libya openly talking about wanting a non-Western world order.
So they're not even trying to hide it.
Nope. They're pretty upfront about their goals. And if these two civilizations with their huge populations and resources can work together effectively,
What could happen?
it could really shake things up. It could lead to a major shift in the balance of power.
Okay, so we've got civilizations rising and falling, forming unlikely alliances. But Huntington also uses this pretty intense phrase,
Which one?
Islam's bloody borders.
Oh, yes.
What's he getting at there?
He's talking about what he calls fault line wars.
Vault line wars.
These are conflicts that erupt where different civilizations meet.
Okay, so literally along the borders where these civilizations come into contact.
Exactly. And these wars are especially dangerous because they can escalate quickly.
How so?
Well, it's not just two countries fighting. It becomes a clash of civilizations as other countries get pulled in based on cultural and religious ties.
So it's like a domino effect.
Yeah, it can spread very quickly.
Yeah.
And that's why Huntington sees these fault line wars as one of the biggest threats to global stability.
Do you have any specific examples of these fault line wars that really illustrate the danger?
Well, the Bosnian War is a prime example. It was incredibly messy conflict.
Okay, remind me who is fighting who in that one.
It was basically Croats, Serbs, and Bosnian Muslims all vying for control.
And it was more than just a local conflict.
Absolutely. Their respective kin countries got involved, and it turned into a major international crisis.
So it became a proxy war with different civilizations backing their own sides.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You had Germany and Austria supporting the Croats, Russia backing the Serbs, and Muslim countries like Iran and Turkey aiding the Bosnian Muslims. It's a tragic tangle of loyalties.
Wow, and all rooted in those deeper cultural and religious identities.
Precisely. And that's what makes these fault line wars so difficult to resolve. They tap into these very deep-seated emotions and beliefs.
Huntington even includes this crazy diagram in the book showing all the different alliances. It's mind-bogglingly complex.
It's like a spider web, right? It
Yeah.
shows how easily these fault line wars can draw in more and more players based on those civilizational ties.
Right.
And things can spiral out of control very quickly.
And it's not just Bosnia, right? There's Armenia and Azerbaijan fighting over Nagorno-Karabakh.
Right.
And the constant tension between India and Pakistan, all places where those civilizational differences play a huge role.
Exactly. And these conflicts are incredibly difficult to resolve because they're about more than just territory or political power.
Right, we talked about that.
They tap into those deep-seated cultural and religious identities.
Yeah.
And compromise is incredibly difficult.
It sounds like Huntington is painting a pretty bleak picture.
Well, he's definitely a realist. He doesn't sugarcoat things.
Is he saying that all-out war between civilizations is inevitable? Like, is that where we're headed?
He doesn't say it's inevitable, but he definitely sees it as a real possibility if we don't manage these civilizational differences very carefully.
So it's a warning.
You could say that. He's saying, hey, wake up, people. This is a serious issue. We need to start thinking about how to prevent this clash of civilizations from turning into a global catastrophe.
Okay, so not a happy bedtime story.
Not exactly, but a necessary one. Sometimes we need a dose of reality to shake us out of our complacency.
So what does he suggest we do? Like, how do we prevent these fault line wars from escalating into something even bigger and more dangerous?
He argues that the major powers within each civilization, the core states, as he calls them, need to exercise restraint.
Okay.
They need to resist the temptation to get sucked into these conflicts.
Even when their kin countries are involved.
Even then. Because he argues that if the core states start intervening militarily, it could quickly escalate into a much wider war.
That sounds really tough, especially when there's so much pressure to support your own cultural group.
It is. But he believes it's necessary for global stability.
Yeah.
He's basically saying, look, We need to prioritize peace over tribalism.
So it's like putting the brakes on those ancient loyalties and rivalries.
Exactly. And it's not easy.
Mm.
But he argues that it's the only way to avoid a future of endless conflict.
So he's calling for a new kind of leadership, one that's more focused on the global good rather than just narrow national or civilizational interests.
You could say that. He's saying that we need leaders who can see beyond those old divisions. Leaders who can bear bridges and find common ground, leaders who can create a more peaceful and stable world.
That's a tall order.
It is. But it's a challenge we have to face if we want to avoid the worst-case scenarios that Huntington outlines.
Okay, now I'm really curious. If civilizations are clashing and competing for power, what does that mean for the future? What's Huntington's take on that?
That's where things get really interesting, and maybe a little scary. He explores this question in depth, and he offers several possible scenarios for the future.
Okay, give us the good, the bad, and the ugly. What are the possible futures he sees?
Well, one scenario is that the West manages to adapt and reform itself.
Okay, so there's hope.
There's always hope. He argues that if we reaffirm our core values, get our own house in order, and find ways to cooperate with other civilizations, we can create a more stable and prosperous world.
So there's a chance for a more cooperative future where civilizations can work together. It's not all doom and gloom.
It's possible,
Hmm.
but it requires a major shift in our thinking and behavior. The West can't just assume it will continue to dominate the world. We need to recognize the legitimacy of other civilizations and find ways to coexist peacefully.
Okay, that's the optimistic scenario. What about the less rosy possibilities? What happens if things don't go so well?
Well, Huntington also outlines a scenario where the West continues to decline both internally and in terms of global influence. He argues that if we lose our sense of unity, our purpose, our strength, we'll be increasingly vulnerable to challenges from those rising civilizations.
And that decline could lead to, spell it out for us.
Well, in the worst-case scenario, it could lead to large-scale conflict, a war between civilizations.
A war between civilizations, that sounds terrifying.
It does, doesn't it? But it's a reminder that the stakes are incredibly high. If we don't manage these civilizational differences effectively, the consequences could be catastrophic.
So is he calling for a new kind of world order, one where civilizations learn to live and work together, even if they have different values and interests?
You could say that. He argues that we need a more multipolar world, where power is more evenly distributed, and different civilizations respect each other's interests and values. He even uses the term civilizational order to describe this new arrangement.
But how realistic is that? Can civilizations really overcome their differences and cooperate on such a large scale? I mean, it's hard enough to get people to agree within their own countries, let alone across entire civilizations.
It's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
No doubt, there's no guarantee of success. But Huntington argues that it's really the only way to avoid a future of endless conflict and instability. The alternative is too frightening to contemplate.
This is a lot to process.
I know, right?
We've gone from the decline of the West to potential wars between civilizations to the need for a whole new world order. My head is spinning.
We have covered a lot of ground just in this first part of our deep dive.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, we're just getting started.
Stay tuned because we're going to keep unpacking these ideas in our next part.
Can't wait.
Oh.
Picking up where we left off last time, let's dig a little deeper into this whole idea of the West's decline.
Okay, yeah. Huntington spends a lot of time on that.
He does. And, you know, one of the things that makes his argument so compelling
Yeah.
is that he doesn't just focus on the present. He actually compares the West's current situation to what happened to past civilizations.
Right. He's looking for those historical patterns, those echoes of the past.
Exactly. He lays out this fascinating, it's almost like a medical diagnosis, you know, breakdown of a civilization's life cycle. And one of the key stages is decline.
Okay, so it's not just that civilizations rise and fall, it's that there's a predictable pattern to it.
That's what he's suggesting, yeah. And he argues that civilizations can experience these periods of serious decay, where things start to break down.
And what are some of the signs of that decay? Like, how do you know when a civilization is starting to go downhill?
Well, he talks about things like a stagnant economy, political chaos,
Yeah.
people losing faith in their leaders.
Sounds familiar.
Right. It's like that loss of vitality, that sense that things are falling apart and nobody knows how to fix them.
It's like watching a civilization get sick and start to weaken.
You could say that. And there's this one quote that really struck me, where Huntington describes the final stages of decline.
Okay, I'm looking.
He talks about a society growing weaker laws failing to stem the tide, and a growing unwillingness to even fight for the civilization anymore.
Wow, that's pretty bleak.
It is. It's a pretty sobering picture. It's like people just give up. They lose faith that things can get better.
So where does he see the West in this cycle? Are we on the verge of collapse? Is that what he's saying?
He doesn't give a definitive answer. He's not like the West is doomed
Right.
or anything like that.
Okay, good.
But he does express serious concerns about our ability to stay united and maintain a sense of purpose.
Okay, so it's not a foregone conclusion, but we're definitely on shaky ground.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Mm-hmm.
He sees these internal divisions and the erosion of our core values as major weaknesses.
This idea of elites losing confidence is interesting to me. How does that play out in the West, especially in a place like the U.S.? We always think of ourselves as, the leader of the free world and all that.
Right. But Huntington argues that some Western elites have actually become disillusioned with their own civilization.
Really?
Yeah, they've lost faith in the values and institutions that made the West successful. They've become almost cynical.
Wow. Okay, and why is that?
Well, he points to a few things. The rise of multiculturalism, for example,
Mm.
which, while well-intentioned, can sometimes lead to a fragmentation of shared identity.
So it's like we're losing that sense of a common purpose.
Exactly. And he also talks about what he calls attacks on the American creed.
The American creed.
It's basically the core set of values that define the U.S., things like individual liberty, limited government, equality of opportunity, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And he sees these attacks coming from both the left and the right.
Interesting. So it's not just one side of the political spectrum that he's worried about.
Nope. He sees this kind of disillusionment and cynicism coming from all sides. And he argues that it's weakening us from within.
So he's worried that the West is losing faith in itself, that we're becoming our own worst enemy.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
And he argues that this internal weakening, combined with the rise of other civilizations, creates a dangerous situation for the West.
Okay, so it's like a double whammy. We're getting weaker on the inside just as other civilizations are getting stronger on the outside.
Exactly. And that makes us more vulnerable. It makes us more likely to make bad decisions. And it makes us less able to respond effectively to challenges.
Okay, so we've got this kind of internal crisis of confidence happening, and then we've got those fault line wars we talked about earlier, those places where different civilizations are rubbing up against each other.
Right. And those conflicts can easily escalate and draw in other players.
You mentioned the Bosnian War as a prime example. Can you unpack that a bit more for us? It sounded like a real nightmare.
It was a nightmare. It was one of those conflicts that just spiraled out of control.
And just to recap, who was fighting who in that one?
You had Croat Serbs and Bosnian Muslims all vying for control of Bosnia, and it quickly escalated beyond just a local conflict.
So it became a proxy war with different civilizations backing their own side.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You had Germany and Austria supporting the Croats,
Yeah.
Russia backing the Serbs, and Muslim countries like Iran and Turkey aiding the Bosnian Muslims.
Yeah.
It became this tragic tangle of loyalties all rooted in those deeper cultural and religious identities.
It's amazing how a conflict in one small corner of the world can suddenly draw in all these major powers.
It's a reminder of how interconnected we are and how those civilizational ties can be incredibly strong, even in the modern world.
Huntington even includes this crazy diagram in the book showing all the different alliances. It's like trying to untangle a ball of yarn.
It is, but it really highlights the complexity of these fault line wars.
Yep.
And how easily they can spiral out of control.
And it's not just Bosnia, right? You mentioned Armenia and Azerbaijan fighting over Nagorno-Karabakh.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan, all places where those civilizational differences play a huge role.
Exactly. And those conflicts are incredibly difficult to resolve precisely because they're about more than just territory or political power.
Right. It's about identity.
It's about who you are,
Mm-hmm.
where you belong, what you believe in.
Mm.
And those are things that people are willing to fight and die for.
So what does Huntington suggest we can do to prevent these fault line wars from escalating into something even bigger and more dangerous? Because it sounds like he's saying that they're almost inevitable, that these clashes are going to happen.
He doesn't say they're inevitable, but he does say we need to be very careful.
Mm-hmm.
He argues that the major powers, the core states, need to exercise restraint.
Okay.
They need to resist the temptation to get sucked into these conflicts, even when their kin countries are involved.
That sounds really tough, especially when there's so much pressure to, defend your own side.
It is a challenge.
Hmm.
But Huntington argues that it's absolutely essential for global stability. He's basically saying that we need to prioritize peace over tribalism, that we need to think about the long-term consequences of our actions.
So it's kind of like being the grown-up in the room.
Yeah. Exactly. It's about taking a step back and saying, okay, is this really worth risking a wider war? Is this in everyone's best interest?
And he even suggests that the West needs to rethink some of its old alliances and commitments from the Cold War era.
He does. He argues that those old alliances might not be relevant or even helpful in this new multi-civilizational world, that we need to forge new partnerships based on shared interests and values rather than just old loyalties.
So he's saying we need to update our thinking, adapt to this new reality where civilizations are the main players.
Exactly. Clinging to old frameworks and alliances could actually make things worse.
Yeah.
We need new ways to manage these civilizational differences and prevent them from exploding into violence.
This brings us to a really big question. If civilizations are clashing and competing for power, what does that mean for the future? I mean, is it all just going to end in a big global war? Is that what Huntington is predicting?
That's where things get really interesting and maybe a little scary. Huntington actually offers several possible scenarios for the future. Some are relatively optimistic, but others are, well, pretty terrifying.
Okay, I have to hear this. Give us the good, the bad, and the ugly. What are the possible futures he sees? Lay it on me.
Okay, so one scenario is that the West manages to adapt and reform itself, that we reaffirm our core values, get our own house in order, and find ways to cooperate with other civilizations.
Okay, so there's a chance we can pull ourselves together and avoid a major clash.
There's a chance, but it requires a lot of hard work and a willingness to change. We can't just keep doing things the way we've always done them. We need to be more flexible, more open-minded, more willing to compromise.
So there's a path to a more cooperative future where civilizations can work together, but it's not going to be easy.
Not at all. But it's worth striving for, because the alternative is pretty grim.
Okay, so what's the alternative? What happens if things don't go so well?
Well, Huntington also outlines a scenario where the West continues to decline, both internally and in terms of global influence.
Okay, so basically we keep going down the path we're on.
Right. And he argues that if we lose our sense of unity, our purpose, our strength, we'll be increasingly vulnerable to challenges from those rising civilizations.
And those challenges could it lead to? Spell it out for us.
Well, in the worst-case scenario, it could lead to large-scale conflict, a war between civilizations.
A war between civilizations. That sounds like the plot of a dystopian movie.
It does, doesn't it? But it's a reminder that the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about a few border skirmishes here. We're talking about a potential global conflagration, something that could reshape the world as we know it.
So he's not messing around.
No, he's not. He's trying to wake people up, to make them realize that this is a serious issue, that we need to start taking it seriously.
So is he calling for a new kind of world order then? One where civilizations learn to live and work together even if they have different values and interests?
You could say that. He argues that we need a more multipolar world, where power is more evenly distributed and different civilizations respect each other's interests and values. He even uses the term civilizational order to describe this new arrangement.
Okay, I get that. But how realistic is that? Can civilizations really overcome their differences and cooperate on such a large scale? I mean, look at the world today. It seems like everyone is more divided than ever.
It's a huge challenge,
Sure.
no doubt. There's no guarantee of success. But Huntington argues that it's really the only way to avoid a future of endless conflict and instability. The alternative is too frightening to contemplate.
It's almost like he's saying we have to evolve as a species. We have to learn to cooperate on a larger scale, or we're going to destroy ourselves.
That's a pretty dramatic way to put it.
Mm.
But I think you're right. We're at a crossroads.
Yeah.
And the choices we make in the next few decades are going to determine the course of human history for centuries to come.
No pressure.
None at all.
Yeah.
Just the future of civilization hanging in the balance.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Huntington's clash of civilizations. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. It's a dense book. Lots to unpack.
We've talked about civilizations clashing, forming alliances, facing those internal struggles, and even vying for global influence.
And you know, the million-dollar question is, what does all of this mean for the future?
Yeah, that's the big one. So before we go, I want to kind of zoom out a bit and bring it back to you, the listener. Why should we even care about these big, sweeping historical trends? How does any of this affect our lives?
You know, it's a good question because it can feel very abstract, this clash of civilizations.
Right, like it's happening on this grand scale.
Exactly. But even if you don't agree with everything Huntington says, his work really forces us to think differently about the world.
Okay, in what way?
It challenges us to look beyond the headlines and those immediate crises and see those deeper cultural forces that are shaping global politics. It's like, you know, getting a new pair of glasses.
Oh, I like that analogy. So you're saying it's not just about understanding history, it's about understanding the present and maybe even predicting the future.
Exactly. If we understand that people often feel a really, really strong sense of loyalty and belonging to their civilization, to their cultural group, it helps us make sense of a lot of things that are happening in the world.
Like what kind of things?
Conflicts, alliances, even those decisions or actions by leaders that seem irrational or self-defeating.
It's like suddenly you see the motivations behind why countries act the way they do. It's not just about, pure self-interest. It's about those deeper cultural factors.
Exactly. Religion, shared history, language.
Yeah.
Those ties that bind people together.
And those ties can be pretty powerful.
Oh, incredibly powerful. They can drive people to do extraordinary things, both good and bad.
So you're saying that this civilizational awareness can actually make us more informed citizens?
Absolutely. More critical consumers of news.
Yeah.
Even more effective in our own personal and professional lives.
Okay, so it's not just an academic exercise, it has real-world application.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Think about it this way.
Mm.
Let's say you're trying to negotiate a business deal with a company from a different civilization.
Okay.
If you understand their cultural values and norms, their understanding of time, authority, different communication styles, it can make a huge difference in building trust and getting to a successful outcome.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. So it's like that saying, knowledge is power. The more you understand about different civilizations, the better equipped you are to deal with a world that's becoming more and more interconnected.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And that's really one of the key takeaways from our deep dive today. Civilizational awareness isn't just for scholars or diplomats. It's a vital skill for anyone who wants to thrive in the 21st century.
So as we wrap up, what's the one big question you hope our listeners are pondering after listening to this deep dive? What's that thought that you want them to take away and really chew on?
Well, throughout this deep dive, we've been grappling with this idea that civilizations are making a comeback, that people are increasingly defining themselves by their cultural heritage.
Right. It's like those old loyalties and rivalries are resurfacing.
Exactly. So the big question is, will this lead to more conflict as civilizations clash over power and values? Or could it actually lead to new forms of cooperation and understanding as we learn to appreciate and respect those differences?
Wow, that's a powerful question, and there's no easy answer.
Definitely not.
Eh.
But it's a question we all have to grapple with. There's no sitting on the sidelines.
Right, we're all part of this, whether we like it or not.
Exactly. Our actions, our choices, the way we engage with the world around us, all contribute to the answer.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We explored civilizations clashing, forming alliances, facing those internal struggles, and vying for global influence. It's a complex topic, and we've only just scratched the surface.
If you're intrigued by what you've heard today, I really encourage you to check out Huntington's Clash of Civilizations for yourself. It's a challenging read, but it will definitely give you a lot to think about. It might even change the way you see the world.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. Sparking your curiosity, challenging your assumptions, and giving you the tools to understand the world a little bit better. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Loved this video? Smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. And don't forget to order the book, link below.